Night had already settled over the city when the first vehicle arrived. Not the kind of vehicle people in that neighborhood were used to seeing. Long, black, expensive, the kind that moved slowly, like it had nothing to fear. Rain tapped steadily against the rusted metal roofs of the small buildings lining the narrow street. Water dripped from crooked gutters. The glow from a single flickering street lamp reflected off puddles in the broken asphalt. At the very end of that street stood a building most people ignored. The Second Chance Animal Rescue Shelter. Old wood. Faded paint. A hand-painted sign nailed crookedly above the door. Inside were cages, blankets, food bowls, and dozens of animals that had once been abandoned. Stray dogs rescued from highways. Cats pulled from dumpsters. Animals nobody else wanted. And on most nights, the only sound you heard from the building was the quiet rustle of paws on blankets, or the soft voice of the woman who ran the place. But tonight was different, because the second SUV had just arrived. And then a third. The engines shut off at the same time. The doors opened almost in sync. Men stepped out. Dark coats. Heavy boots hitting wet pavement. No one spoke. They didn't need to. The message was already clear. Something was about to happen here. Inside the shelter, the animals sensed it first. Dogs began barking. Low at first. Then louder. A chain rattled against a metal gate. A cat knocked over a food bowl. And within seconds the quiet building turned into a storm of noise. Then the gate outside the shelter creaked open. The men walked in. One of them kicked the door. The old wood burst inward with a sharp crack. Inside the room, cages rattled as frightened animals jumped against the bars. A woman rushed forward. "Wait!" Her voice broke through the chaos. She was soaked from the rain. Her hair pulled back in a loose braid. Mud on her shoes. Exhaustion written across her face. But she didn't step away. She stood directly between the men and the rows of cages. "Please," she said, breath shaking. "You can't do this. Those animals will die without this place." The men didn't answer. They simply started moving. One pulled down a shelf of supplies. Another dragged a metal cage across the floor. The sound of barking grew louder. Desperate. Confused. A dog slammed its paws against the bars again and again. The woman tried to block them. "Stop!" But one of the men gently pushed her aside. Not violently. Just enough to make it clear. She had no power here. Outside, another figure stepped out of the final SUV. He didn't rush. Didn't shout orders. He simply walked forward. Slow. Measured. The rain fell harder now, dripping from the edge of his black coat. Every man in the yard straightened when he appeared. They all knew who he was. Everyone in the city knew his name. Kang Min-jae, 42 years old, leader of an organization that controlled entire districts. Businesses, nightclubs, shipping companies, real estate. If a deal happened in the city's shadows, chances were his people knew about it. Some called him ruthless. Others called him disciplined. But everyone agreed on one thing. When Kang Min-jae made a decision, it happened. No arguments. No hesitation. Inside the shelter, another shelf crashed to the floor. Bags of dog food burst open. Kibbles scattered across the wet ground. The woman rushed toward the cages, trying to calm the animals. Her voice trembled. It's okay. I'm here." But the men kept working. Another wall panel came down. Wood splintered. Rain began leaking through the broken roof. Kang Min-jae stepped inside. His eyes scanned the room. Quick. Calculating. This building sat on land his organization had already purchased. The plan was simple. Clear the structure. Begin construction. A luxury development project that would be worth millions. And in his world, small obstacles were removed quickly. Emotion never entered the equation. The woman turned when she saw him. For a moment she didn't say anything. She just stared. Because even if she didn't know his full story, she recognized the kind of power he carried. "You're the one in charge," she said quietly. Min-jae didn't answer. His men continued pulling down sections of the wall. Animals howled. Cages clanged. The woman stepped closer to him. Rain dripped through the broken roof onto the floor between them. "You can build somewhere else," she said. There's empty land all over this city. Still no response. She pointed toward the cages. They don't have anywhere else to go. One of the men behind Min-jae leaned close to his ear. Boss, we should finish quickly. The trucks arrive in 20 minutes. Min-jae nodded slightly. The work continued. Another cage slid across the floor. The woman dropped to her knees beside a trembling dog. Her voice cracked now. Please. For the first time, Min-jae looked directly at her. Not the animals. Not the building. Her. Mud covered the sleeves of her jacket. Her hands were shaking. But she didn't run. Didn't beg for herself. Only for the animals. Please, she said again. You're destroying their only home. One of Min-jae's men walked past her carrying a broken wooden beam. As he passed the doorway, he paused. He glanced at the woman again. Then at Min-jae. Something about her voice had caught his attention. He frowned, then stepped closer to his boss. Sir. Min-jae didn't turn, but the man continued. There's something strange. Min-jae finally looked at him. The man hesitated. Her voice. Min-jae's expression didn't change. What about it? The man lowered his voice. I've heard it before. For a moment the rain was the only sound in the room. Min-jae looked back toward the woman. She was kneeling beside a cage now, trying to calm a terrified dog. Her hand rested gently against the metal bars. It's okay, she whispered to the animal. I'm here. The man beside Min-jae leaned closer. 6 months ago, at the hospital. Min-jae's eyes narrowed slightly. The memory surfaced slowly. A hospital corridor. Doctors moving quickly. His mother lying unconscious on a stretcher. And the hospital staff explaining something he had never expected to hear. Someone had helped her before the ambulance arrived. A stranger. A woman who stayed beside her until the paramedics came. Without that help, the outcome would have been very different. 4 months Min-jae had tried to find that woman. Security footage had been incomplete. Witnesses remembered only fragments. A voice. A calm voice speaking to his mother. Telling her to stay awake. Telling her she wasn't alone. Min-jae looked again at the woman kneeling on the floor. Rain dripped from her hair. Mud stained her jacket. Her hand still rested gently against the cage. And as she spoke softly to the frightened dog, something inside his memory locked into place. The same voice. The same calm tone. The same quiet determination. The man beside him whispered again. Boss. I'm sure of it. Min-jae didn't answer. He simply stared at the woman, trying to understand what he was seeing, because if the memory was correct, then the woman whose shelter his men were tearing apart was the same person who once stood beside his mother in her most vulnerable moment. The same stranger who refused to walk away. And suddenly, one question echoed in his mind. Why hadn't he recognized her sooner? The woman finally looked up. Her eyes met his. Neither of them spoke. But within seconds, everything in that room was about to change. Before the black SUVs ever turned onto that narrow street, before the sound of breaking wood and frightened animals filled the night, there was simply a woman and a promise she refused to break. Her name is Zenith James, 34 years old. Most people in the city have never heard of her. She does not run a famous organization. She does not appear in charity galas or newspaper headlines. And yet, on the forgotten edge of the city, her work quietly changed hundreds of lives. Not human lives. Animal lives. The building at the center of that storm of destruction is called Second Chance Animal Rescue. Calling it a facility would be generous. The structure is small. Old timber frames. Patches of faded blue paint barely clinging to the walls. A roof that leaks every time the rain comes down hard enough. In the winter months, the wind slips through the cracks in the boards. In the summer, the heat settles inside like a blanket that refuses to lift. But to the animals inside, it was safety. Metal cages line the interior walls. Some donated. Some repaired again and again with wire and scrap pieces of steel. Blankets cover the floors of the larger pens. Most of them mismatched. Some stitched together by hand. There are bowls for food, plastic tubs for water, and small handwritten tags attached to many of the cages. Names. Each animal has one. Because to Zenith, none of them were just strays. There was Rex, a shepherd mix rescued from the side of a highway. Milo, a one-eyed cat who used to hide behind the washing machines of a laundromat. Tango, a three-legged terrier who learned to run faster than dogs twice his size. Every animal here had a story, and most of those stories started the same way. Abandonment, injury, neglect, or simply being unwanted. Zenith understood those stories better than most, because she grew up in a place where survival often depended on how much you were willing to endure. She was raised in a working-class neighborhood on the south side of the city. Small apartments, cracked sidewalks, streetlights that flickered more often than they stayed bright. Her father worked construction. Long days, heavy tools, hands permanently rough from years of lifting steel and concrete. Her mother cleaned houses across the city. She woke before sunrise most mornings, took 2 buses to reach neighborhoods where the lawns were trimmed perfectly and the windows gleamed like mirrors. Money was always tight. There were months when the refrigerator looked nearly empty. But Zenith remembers something important about those years. Her parents never turned away anyone who needed help. If a neighbor was sick, her mother cooked extra food. If someone's car broke down, her father fixed it. Quiet acts of kindness. No attention, no reward, just the belief that helping others mattered. Zenith carried that belief with her as she grew older. But she didn't know yet how that belief would shape the rest of her life. Until one afternoon when she was 14 years old. The memory is still clear. A small grocery store on the corner of Maple Street. A delivery truck idling beside the loading dock. And behind a stack of cardboard boxes, a faint sound. Whimpering. Soft. Weak. Zenith followed the sound. And there, tucked into the narrow space behind the dumpster, she found a puppy. Thin ribs showing beneath patchy fur. Eyes barely open. Too tired even to bark. Someone had left it there. Most people walking past the alley never noticed. But Zenith did. She remembers crouching down slowly, speaking softly so the puppy wouldn't panic. "It's okay," she whispered. The same words she would say to frightened animals many years later. She wrapped the puppy in her jacket and carried it home. Her parents weren't sure what to do at first. Another mouth to feed was not something the family could easily manage. But Zenith refused to give up. She fed the puppy small portions of food, cleaned its wounds, stayed awake through the night more than once, making sure it was warm. Weeks passed. The puppy grew stronger. Its tail began wagging whenever Zenith walked into the room. That moment, that connection, changed something inside her. Because for the first time she understood something powerful. A life that had been ignored could be saved with patience and care. From that day forward, animals became part of her world. At first it was small things. Leaving food outside for stray cats. Helping neighbors find homes for unwanted puppies. Taking injured animals to local veterinarians who sometimes treated them for free. But as the years passed, Zenith realized the problem was bigger than she imagined. Stray animals filled the streets in many parts of the city. Some injured, some starving. Many simply abandoned when their owners decided they no longer wanted the responsibility. Shelters were already full. Rescue groups had waiting lists. And the animals with medical problems, or those considered too old, were often the last ones anyone chose. Zenith could not ignore it, so she made a decision. Not a perfect plan. Not a carefully calculated business strategy. Just a decision built on determination. She would start a rescue shelter herself. The building she eventually found was barely affordable. An old storage facility that had been empty for years. The roof leaked. The wiring needed repairs. And the wooden beams groaned during heavy storms. But the price was low enough for her to take the risk. Zenith poured everything she had into that place. Savings. Long hours of labor. Friends occasionally volunteering on weekends. Slowly, the building transformed. Not into something fancy, but into something meaningful. Cages were installed. Floors cleaned. A small outdoor run built using donated fencing. And the animals began to arrive. First a handful, then dozens. Word spread through the neighborhoods. If you find a stray animal, call Zenith. If a dog is injured, Zenith will know what to do. If a kitten needs help, take it to the little shelter at the end of the street. But compassion alone cannot keep a rescue shelter running. Food costs money. Medicine costs money. Repairs cost money. And each month the bills stacked higher. Veterinary care. Vaccinations. Emergency surgeries for animals found in terrible condition. Zenith often worked 2 additional jobs just to keep the lights on. Morning shifts at a small cafe. Late-night cleaning work at an office building downtown. Then returning to the shelter before sunrise to feed the animals. Sleep became a rare luxury. Yet whenever someone asked why she didn't close the shelter, her answer was always the same. Simple. Direct. If no one fights for the abandoned, they disappear. But the truth is, determination alone cannot stop financial pressure forever. By the time Zenith turned 34, the shelter was in serious trouble. The roof leaked worse than ever. Winter storms damaged part of the fence. Several animals required expensive medical treatment. And the donations she relied on were becoming less frequent. Some nights she sat alone at the small wooden desk inside the office, reviewing stacks of unpaid invoices. Numbers circled in red ink. Rent, electricity, veterinary clinics waiting for payment. More than once she wondered how long she could continue. Then one afternoon, something arrived in the mail. A plain envelope. No handwritten message. No friendly explanation. Just a formal document. A notice. Printed in bold legal language. The land beneath the shelter had been purchased. A development project was planned, and the building occupying the property would need to be cleared. The message was short. Direct. Vacate the premises. Zenith read the letter again. Then a third time. Her hands slowly lowered the paper onto the desk. Outside, several dogs barked in the exercise yard. Inside the shelter, a volunteer laughed softly while playing with a group of kittens. For a moment, everything seemed normal. But Zenith understood something immediately. Someone powerful now wanted the land where Second Chance Animal Rescue stood. And judging by the tone of that notice, they were not asking politely. Long before the night when black SUVs rolled into the narrow street. Long before the sound of wood splintering and frightened animals filled the air. Another story had already been unfolding across the city. A story tied to power, influence, and a man whose name carried weight in places most people never see. His name is Kong Min-jae, 42 years old. In public records, his presence is almost invisible. There are no flashy interviews, no magazine covers, no official company profiles that tell the full story. Yet behind closed doors, business leaders know the name. Real estate developers know the name. Even certain government officials know it, because in the complicated machinery of the city's underworld, Kong Min-jae sits at the center of a network few outsiders truly understand. Some call him a crime boss. Others prefer the quieter term, operator. But whatever label people choose, one fact remains constant. When Kong Min-jae gives an order, things move quickly. Construction projects begin overnight. Businesses change ownership without public explanation. And disputes that once dragged on for months suddenly find resolution. Efficient. Precise. Calculated. People who have worked near him often describe the same thing. He rarely raises his voice. He does not argue. He simply decides. And then the decision becomes reality. Those who oppose him rarely do so for long. Yet the story of Kong Min-jae did not begin in luxury offices or guarded compounds. It began in a very different place. A cramped apartment above a row of aging storefronts. Peeling wallpaper. A single heater struggling through cold winters. And a mother doing everything she could to keep her son safe. Min-jae was only a child when his father disappeared from his life. The details were never discussed publicly. What remained afterward was silence. And responsibility. His mother suddenly carried the entire weight of the household. Morning. Afternoon. Night. 3 jobs, sometimes more. During the early hours she operated a small street food cart near a busy train station. Steam rising from metal pots as commuters rushed past. She sold bowls of soup, rice cakes, anything that could be cooked quickly and cheaply. After that shift ended, She traveled across the city to a laundry facility where industrial machines roared all afternoon. The work was exhausting. Heavy bags of clothing, constant heat, hands soaked in water and detergent until the skin cracked. But she never complained, because there was always another job waiting after sunset. Cleaning offices, empty hallways, rows of desks where corporate employees had already gone home. For young Min-jae, those long hours shaped everything he understood about the world. He saw exhaustion in his mother's eyes when she returned home late at night. He saw the bruises on her hands. He saw the quiet relief when she counted the small pile of cash she earned at the end of each day. And from an early age, he made a decision. He would protect her, no matter what it required. Neighbors often remember the same thing about the boy. He was quiet, serious, always watching. While other children played in the streets, Min-jae stayed close to the apartment building, helping his mother carry supplies or waiting outside the train station when her food cart closed late. He grew strong quickly. Years of lifting heavy boxes for his mother built muscles long before he reached adulthood. But strength alone does not shape a person's future. Environment does. And the neighborhood where Min-jae grew up offered constant lessons about power. Some people struggled endlessly just to survive. Others seemed to control everything around them. Certain men walked through the streets with an authority that made shop owners step aside. Cars arrived for them. Money moved in their direction. Problems disappeared when they spoke. Young Min-jae watched all of it carefully. He began to understand something many people learn much later in life. Kindness alone does not protect you. Power does. And power often lives far away from official rules. By the time Min-jae reached his late teens, the path ahead of him had already begun to form. He started with small jobs. Errands, deliveries, carrying packages for men who operated in quiet corners of the city. Nothing dramatic at first, just work that required discipline and reliability. And Min-jae possessed both. He never arrived late, never lost money, never spoke about things he was not supposed to discuss. That kind of consistency does not go unnoticed. Gradually the responsibilities increased. More trust, more access, more knowledge about how certain deals were arranged behind closed doors. While others chased quick rewards, Min-jae studied the system. Who controlled which districts? Which businesses generated steady income? Which alliances were fragile? And most importantly, which mistakes destroyed people? Over the years his reputation grew. Not because he was loud or reckless, but because he was careful, strategic, patient. Where others reacted emotionally, Min-jae paused. Where others fought openly, he waited for the moment when action would carry the greatest impact. Eventually that discipline carried him to the top of an organization that operated across multiple sectors. Shipping routes, nightclubs, security companies, and real estate developments that transformed entire neighborhoods. The empire he helped build was not chaotic. It was organized, structured, every decision flowing through a clear chain of command. At the very top, Kang Min-jae. Those who work with him often notice the same unusual quality. Despite the power surrounding him, he keeps his personal life extremely small. Few close friends, no public relationships, no extravagant lifestyle that attracts unnecessary attention. His world revolves around work, strategy, control. But there is one exception. One person who occupies a place in his life that nothing else can replace. His mother. Even after the organization grew powerful, Min-jae never forgot the years he watched her struggle. He purchased a quiet home for her away from the crowded neighborhood where they once lived. He made sure she never needed to work another exhausting shift again. And every week, no matter how complicated his schedule became, he visited her. Sometimes bringing groceries, sometimes simply sitting with her in the garden while she talked about ordinary things. Those moments were rare glimpses of a different version of Kang Min-jae, a version that existed long before power and reputation reshaped his world. But several months before the night at the animal shelter, something happened that nearly changed everything. It was a normal afternoon in the city, traffic moving through crowded streets. pedestrians rushing between stores and subway stations. Min-jae's mother had gone out for a simple walk. Doctors later explained that her heart condition had been developing quietly for years. No obvious warning, no dramatic signal, just a sudden collapse on a sidewalk filled with strangers. People gathered quickly. Some stared, some whispered, but very few stepped forward. Minutes can stretch endlessly in moments like that, especially when someone lies motionless on cold pavement while the world hesitates around them. An ambulance was eventually called. Paramedics arrived, and she was rushed to the hospital. When Min-jae received the phone call, he left a meeting immediately. The drive across the city felt longer than it should have. Traffic lights, crowded intersections, every delay grinding against his patience. By the time he reached the hospital, doctors were already working inside the emergency department. Machines, bright lights, voices moving quickly across the room. For the first time in many years, Kang Min-jae felt something he rarely allowed himself to experience. Uncertainty. Hours passed. Finally, a doctor stepped into the hallway. The news was complicated. Serious condition. But there was one important detail. Someone had helped her before the ambulance arrived. A woman. A stranger who stayed beside her on the sidewalk. She called emergency services, checked her breathing, spoke to her calmly while waiting for paramedics. The doctor explained something quietly. Those early moments mattered. Without that assistance, the situation might have ended very differently. Min-jae asked for the woman's name, but the answer surprised him. No one knew it. She left before the ambulance doors closed. No introduction. No request for recognition. Just a quiet act of help, followed by disappearance into the crowd. For weeks afterward, Min-jae instructed his people to search. Security cameras, witness accounts, anyone who might have seen her. But the trail remained incomplete. The stranger who helped his mother simply vanished back into the city. And despite his resources, Kang Min-jae never found her. At least, not at that time. Because months later, on a rain-soaked night at a small animal shelter on the edge of the city, he would hear a voice again. A voice that carried a strange sense of familiarity. And the moment he finally realized where he had heard it before, everything around him would stop. 6 months before the rain-soaked night at the shelter, before the sound of splintering would before frightened animals scattered across the floor, something happened in the middle of the city that almost no one remembers. A moment that lasted only minutes. A moment most people walked past. But a moment that quietly tied 2 lives together long before either of them realized it. It was a weekday afternoon. Traffic moved slowly through crowded intersections. Car horns echoed between tall buildings. People hurried across crosswalks with phones pressed to their ears, bags swinging from their shoulders, minds focused on the endless list of tasks waiting for them. In cities like this, life rarely pauses. Everyone moves. Everyone rushes. And sometimes important moments unfold in the middle of all that motion without anyone truly seeing them. At exactly 2:17 p.m., a woman stepped off the curb at the corner of Hanul Avenue and 7th Street. She was small in stature, gray hair pulled neatly behind her head, a simple shopping bag resting against her side. Most people passing by would never have guessed she was the mother of one of the most powerful men in the city. To them, she looked like any other elderly resident running errands. The traffic light changed. Cars began slowing. Pedestrians crossed the street. Halfway across the intersection, something went wrong. Witnesses later described the same thing. At first, she simply slowed her steps. Then she stopped completely. Her hand pressed against her chest. Her body swayed slightly, and within seconds she collapsed onto the pavement. The sound of the fall was soft, but it carried across the sidewalk. People nearby turned. Several stopped walking. A small crowd formed almost immediately. Someone gasped. Another person whispered, "Call someone." Yet strangely, no one moved closer. It happens more often than people like to admit. When emergencies appear suddenly in public spaces, hesitation spreads through the crowd. Each person waits for someone else to act first. Seconds pass. Then more seconds. Questions float through the air. Is she okay? Did anyone call an ambulance? But the woman remained on the pavement, breathing shallow, eyes barely open. Her shopping bag had rolled a few feet away, oranges spilling across the sidewalk. Cars slowed near the intersection. Drivers leaned slightly toward their windows, trying to understand what was happening. Yet the crowd remained frozen, watching, waiting, until another vehicle approached the intersection from the south side of the street. Inside that car sat Zenith James, the same woman who would one day kneel on the muddy floor of a damaged animal shelter, pleading for the safety of abandoned animals. But on that afternoon, she was simply driving back from a veterinary clinic. The passenger seat beside her held a cardboard box filled with medical supplies for the shelter. Bandages, antibiotics, a small bottle of disinfectant. She noticed the crowd before she even reached the traffic light. A cluster of people standing in a loose circle on the sidewalk. Traffic slowing. Heads turning. Instinct told her something wasn't right. Zenith pulled her car toward the curb. The moment she stepped out, she could see the woman lying on the ground. People were standing nearby, looking down, but no one was kneeling beside her. No one was speaking to her. No one had taken control of the situation. Zenith moved quickly. "Excuse me," she said, pushing gently through the small crowd. Her voice carried urgency but not panic. Years of rescuing injured animals had trained her to stay calm when things looked frightening. She knelt beside the woman. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" The woman's eyes flickered slightly. Her breathing was uneven. Zenith glanced at the faces around her. Did anyone call emergency services? A few people looked at each other. One person shrugged. Another shook their head. Zenith reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. Her fingers moved quickly across the screen. Within seconds, she was speaking to an operator. "Yes, I need an ambulance," she said firmly. An elderly woman collapsed at Hanol Avenue and 7th Street. She described the symptoms. The breathing. The lack of movement. The operator assured her that paramedics were already being dispatched. Zenith ended the call. Then she did something simple, but powerful. She stayed. She placed one hand gently over the woman's. The skin was cold. "Help is coming," Zenith said softly. "You're not alone." The crowd watched in silence. A few people finally stepped closer. Someone moved the fallen shopping bag aside. Another person picked up the scattered oranges. But Zenith remained focused on the woman beside her. Minutes passed slowly. Traffic lights changed. The distant sound of sirens began to rise above the noise of the street. Quiet words. Steady reassurance. "You're doing okay," she said. "Just keep breathing." For the woman on the pavement, those words were more than comfort. They were an anchor, a voice cutting through confusion and fear. When the ambulance finally arrived, paramedics moved quickly. Medical equipment appeared. Vitals checked. Oxygen mask secured. One of the paramedics glanced at Zenith. "Were you the one who called?" She nodded. "And you stayed with her the whole time?" "Yes." The paramedic gave a small, grateful smile. "That probably helped more than you realize." Within moments, the stretcher was loaded into the ambulance. Doors closed. Sirens activated again. And just like that, the vehicle disappeared into traffic. Most of the crowd drifted away. Phones came back out. Conversations resumed. The city returned to its constant movement. Zenith stood on the sidewalk for a moment, watching the ambulance lights fade into the distance. She didn't know the woman's name. She didn't know who her family was. She only knew that someone had needed help. And she happened to be there. After a few seconds, Zenith walked back to her car. She climbed inside, placed both hands on the steering wheel, and continued driving. No dramatic speech. No attempt to follow the ambulance. No desire for recognition. Just a quiet decision to return to the shelter, where dozens of animals were waiting for their evening meal. Later that night, doctors at the hospital reviewed the medical timeline. They spoke quietly with the patient's son, a man who had arrived in the emergency department with an expression rarely seen on his face. Concern. The doctors explained something important. The woman had received assistance quickly. Someone kept her conscious. Someone contacted emergency services without delay. Those early minutes made a difference. Without them, the outcome might have been far worse. The son listened carefully. His name, of course, was Kang Min-jae, and he asked a simple question. Who helped her? Hospital staff searched their records. Security footage from the entrance cameras showed glimpses of the stretcher arriving. But the woman who had been on the sidewalk, she wasn't in the frame long enough to identify. Witnesses described her only vaguely. A young woman, calm voice, dark hair tied back, helpful, then gone. For weeks afterward, Min-jae instructed his people to find her. Not out of obligation, but because something inside him insisted that a debt like that deserved recognition. Surveillance footage from nearby shops was examined. Street cameras reviewed. Yet the stranger remained anonymous. The city had swallowed her identity, or so it seemed, because 6 months later, on a rain-soaked night at the far edge of the city, Kang Min-jae would stand inside a crumbling animal shelter, with splintering around him, animals crying out in fear. And in the middle of that chaos, he would hear a voice speaking softly to a frightened dog, a voice that had kept his mother conscious, on a crowded sidewalk. And in that moment, the stranger he had searched for across the entire city would finally be standing right in front of him. Major construction projects rarely begin with the sound of bulldozers. They begin much earlier, in quiet meeting rooms, behind closed doors, with maps spread across polished tables and numbers written across financial reports. And several months before the rain-soaked night at the shelter, one of those meetings was already underway. High above the city, inside a private office overlooking blocks of aging warehouses and neglected industrial buildings, Kang Min-jae sat across from a group of advisors. Large screens displayed architectural renderings, glass towers, luxury apartments, shopping spaces, underground parking, a development designed to transform an entire district. The numbers were staggering, billions in projected value over time, hundreds of new residents, investors already showing interest. But projects like this require something simple and extremely complicated at the same time. Land, not scattered plots, not fragmented ownership, a continuous stretch large enough to support an entirely new neighborhood. And the land they needed was almost perfect. Almost. One small section remained occupied, a single structure standing at the edge of the development zone. Old, neglected, barely visible on the city planning maps. Second Chance Animal Rescue. During the meeting, one of Min-jae's advisors pointed toward the digital blueprint. That building sits directly in the center of the construction entrance route, he explained. Another advisor adjusted his glasses. We've contacted the property holder through legal channels. Min-jae listened without interrupting. What was the response? He asked. The room grew quiet for a moment. She hasn't agreed to vacate yet. Why? The advisor glanced at a folder in front of him. It's an animal shelter. Min-jae's expression remained neutral. She says the animals have nowhere else to go. The advisor paused, then added something important. Legally, we can move forward with eviction. The development company owns the land now. Another voice spoke from the far end of the table. If we delay construction, investors will start asking questions. Silence followed. Then the oldest advisor in the room leaned forward. His voice was calm but firm. In projects of this scale, hesitation creates complications. Min-jae looked toward him. The man continued. Small problems become big problems if you give them time. No one argued, because everyone at that table understood the unspoken rule that governed their work. Momentum mattered. If one obstacle slowed the project, others could follow. Min-jae leaned back in his chair. His eyes moved slowly across the digital blueprint again. One small square, one aging building, a shelter full of animals, and a woman who refused to leave. Finally he spoke. Remove it. 2 simple words. No emotion, no dramatic tone, just a decision. And once Kang Min-jae made a decision, events began moving quickly. Legal notices were sent, follow-up letters delivered, deadlines extended and then closed. But the response from the shelter never changed. The woman who ran the place continued asking for time. Time to relocate the animals. Time to find another property. Time to raise money. But construction schedules rarely bend around compassion. And eventually, Min Jae's organization prepared to clear the site. That preparation led directly to the night when black SUVs turned onto the narrow street. The rain had already begun falling when the vehicles arrived. The headlights illuminated the faded wooden sign hanging above the gate. Second Chance Animal Rescue. Inside the fence, several dogs barked immediately. Animals often sense unfamiliar energy before humans do. Boots stepped onto wet pavement. Car doors closed. Men moved toward the entrance. Then something unexpected happened. The gate was already open, and standing directly in front of it was Zenith James. She must have heard the engines long before the vehicles stopped. Neighbors later said the shelter lights turned on nearly 10 minutes earlier. As if she had been waiting for the moment she knew was coming. Zenith stood alone beneath the dim glow of the street lamp. Rain soaked the shoulders of her jacket. Her hands were clenched at her sides. Behind her, inside the yard, several dogs barked loudly. Cats scattered toward the back of the building. But Zenith didn't step aside. When the men approached the gate, she raised one hand. "Stop!" Her voice carried more strength than the situation suggested she should have. The men slowed slightly. Then one of them spoke. "You need to move." Zenith shook her head. "This place isn't empty land," she said. "There are lives here." The man glanced back toward the vehicles. Moments later, the final door opened. Kang Min-jae stepped out. The rain rolled down the smooth surface of his coat as he walked forward. Every man in the yard adjusted their posture slightly. Even without introductions, it was clear who was in charge. Zenith watched him approach. She had never met him before. But something about his presence made the air feel heavier. Min-jae stopped a few feet away. His eyes moved briefly across the shelter building. The damaged roof. The crooked fencing. The faded paint. Then he looked at Zenith. "You received the notice," he said calmly. "Yes. And you chose not to leave." Her answer came immediately. "I chose not to abandon them." She stepped slightly to the side, gesturing toward the shelter behind her. Inside the building, a dog barked loudly, scratching at the door. "They depend on this place," she said. Min-jae remained still. "This land belongs to my company now. You can build somewhere else. It's already planned." Zenith's voice rose slightly. "You're talking about concrete and glass. I'm talking about living creatures." Rain dripped steadily between them. For several seconds neither of them moved. Then Min-jae spoke again. "Begin." The command was directed toward the men behind him. They moved immediately. One stepped past Zenith and pushed open the shelter door. Another began unloading tools from the vehicles. Wood cracked. Metal gates rattled. Within moments the quiet shelter transformed into chaos. Dogs barked wildly. Cats jumped from shelves. Zenith ran toward the entrance. "Stop!" But the men continued. A wooden panel fell from the wall. A stack of food bags tipped over. Kibble scattered across the wet floor. Zenith rushed between cages, trying to calm the animals. It's okay." Her voice trembled, but she kept moving. "You're safe." Outside, Min-jae watched the scene without visible reaction. To him, the building was simply the final obstacle in a project that had already been approved. But something about the woman's determination held his attention. She wasn't shouting insults. She wasn't threatening lawsuits. She was speaking only to the animals. One of his men dragged a cage toward the door. The metal scraped loudly across the floor. Zenith dropped to her knees beside it. "Please." Her voice cracked. "You can destroy buildings." She looked directly at Min-jae now. "But you won't destroy their lives." For a moment the rain seemed louder. Min-jae's expression didn't change. He simply raised his hand slightly. The men continued working. Another section of wall came down. Animals cried out in panic. And Zenith moved quickly from cage to cage, whispering calming words. Then something unexpected happened. A bodyguard standing near the doorway paused. His head tilted slightly. He looked toward Zenith again. Not at her face. At her voice. She was crouched beside a trembling dog now. One hand resting gently on the metal bars. It's okay, she whispered softly. I'm here. The bodyguard frowned, because something about that voice sounded familiar. Very familiar. He stepped closer to Kong Minjae, lowering his voice so the others couldn't hear. Boss! Minjae didn't turn. What is it? The man hesitated, then spoke carefully. I think I've heard her before. For the first time since arriving, Minjae looked back toward Zenith. Rain dripping from the broken roof. Animals crying around her. Her voice calm despite the chaos. And somewhere deep in his memory, a connection was beginning to form, because the more he listened, the more that voice reminded him of a moment months earlier. A crowded sidewalk. A woman speaking gently to someone lying on the ground. And suddenly, Kong Minjae realized he needed to hear her speak again. Sometimes the most powerful turning points in a person's life do not arrive with noise. No shouting, no dramatic announcement. Just a quiet moment when a single detail suddenly connects pieces of a story that once seemed unrelated. On that rain-filled night at the shelter, that moment arrived in the middle of chaos. Wood had already splintered. Cages had been dragged across the floor. The frightened sounds of animals echoed through the building. Men moved quickly through the structure, following the instructions they had been given earlier that evening. Clear the site. Remove anything standing in the way. To them, it was simply another assignment. But near the entrance, one of Kong Minjae's bodyguards had stopped moving. He was watching the woman kneeling beside the cages, listening carefully. Her voice carried above the noise. Soft. Calm. Steady. It's okay, she whispered to a trembling dog pressing against the bars. You're safe. I'm here. The bodyguard frowned slightly, not because of what she said, but because something about that voice stirred a memory from months earlier. He stepped closer to Minjae and lowered his voice. Boss! Minjae's attention shifted toward him. What is it? The man hesitated before speaking again. That voice. He glanced back toward Zenith James. It sounds familiar. For a brief moment, Minjae didn't respond, but his eyes moved slowly toward the woman inside the shelter. She was crouched beside a small metal cage. Rain dripped through the damaged roof above her, darkening the sleeves of her jacket. Around her, animals cried out in confusion and fear. Yet she remained focused on calming them. Her hand rested gently against the bars. Her voice never rose. It's okay, she repeated quietly. Minjae watched her more carefully now. Listening. Studying. Something deep in his memory began to stir. A voice. A calm tone cutting through panic. A stranger speaking to someone lying on cold pavement. The memory had never completely faded. But until this moment, it had never resurfaced so clearly. His bodyguard spoke again. 6 months ago, the man said quietly. At the hospital. Minjae's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. The hospital hallway appeared in his mind. Bright lights. Doctors moving quickly. Machines beeping in the emergency room. And a single question that had stayed with him since that night. Who was the woman who helped his mother? He remembered standing outside the treatment room, listening as doctors explained what had happened on the street. Someone had stayed with her before the ambulance arrived. Someone had called for help immediately. Someone had kept her awake, speaking calmly while waiting for paramedics. Without that help, the situation could have ended very differently. Minjae had spent weeks searching for the stranger. Security footage, witness statements, any trace of the woman who had stepped forward when others hesitated. But the investigation reached a dead end. The stranger remained unidentified. Until now. Back inside the shelter, Zenith rose from the floor and moved toward another cage. A cat hissed from the corner. She knelt again. Easy, easy, she whispered. Her voice was the same one echoing through Minjae's memory. The same steady tone he had heard described by hospital staff. The same voice he had listened to repeatedly on a short fragment of street camera audio. Minjae took a slow step forward. Rain tapped against the broken boards of the building. Another beam fell somewhere in the back room. But he barely noticed. His attention remained fixed on the woman kneeling beside the cage. He studied her face now. Mud on her jacket. Hair tied loosely behind her head. Exhaustion visible in the lines around her eyes. She looked nothing like the mysterious stranger he had imagined during months of searching. And yet the evidence was impossible to ignore. This woman, the one pleading for the safety of abandoned animals, was the same person who had once stayed beside his mother on a crowded sidewalk. The realization settled slowly. Heavy, unexpected, because the situation unfolding in front of him suddenly felt very different. Minutes earlier, the building had simply been an obstacle in a development project. Now it was something else entirely. Min-jae stopped walking. Behind him, several of his men were still working. One lifted a wooden panel from the wall. Another prepared to remove a row of cages. Then Min-jae raised his hand slightly. The movement was subtle, but every man in the room saw it. And immediately they stopped. The noise faded. The scraping of metal ceased. The barking of the dogs became the loudest sound in the building. Zenith looked up, confused by the sudden silence. Her eyes moved across the room. The men had frozen in place, all of them watching their leader. She followed their gaze, and finally looked directly at Kang Min-jae. To her, he was simply the man responsible for the destruction happening around her. A powerful figure who had arrived with a group of strangers and begun tearing apart the only refuge these animals had ever known. She stood slowly. Rain dripped from the broken roof between them. For the first time since the confrontation began, the shelter was completely quiet. Min-jae studied her carefully. There was no anger in her expression now, only exhaustion and determination. She had been fighting for the animals for nearly an hour, running from cage to cage, trying to calm them while the building came apart around her. And she still refused to step away. Min-jae took another slow step closer. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet, almost conversational. 6 months ago. Zenith frowned slightly. Were you near Hanul Street Hospital? The question seemed to surprise her. For a moment she didn't answer. Her eyes searched his face, trying to understand why a man in the middle of destroying her shelter would suddenly ask something so unrelated. Finally she spoke. Yes. The word hung in the air between them. Min-jae continued watching her. Did you help an elderly woman who collapsed on the street? Zenith blinked. The memory returned instantly. The busy intersection. The crowd of onlookers. The woman lying on the pavement. Yes, she said slowly. I called an ambulance. Another pause. Then she added something simple. I stayed with her until the paramedics arrived. Inside the shelter, several of Min-jae's men exchanged confused glances. None of them fully understood what their boss was asking. But Min-jae understood. Completely. Because the woman standing in front of him had just confirmed something that changed everything. The stranger he had searched for across the city. The person who helped his mother during the most fragile moment of her life. The person whose name he never managed to learn. Was standing right here. Inside a damaged animal shelter. Surrounded by frightened animals. Looking at him with the quiet defiance of someone protecting the only home they have. And suddenly, the entire situation took on a meaning no one in that room had expected. Because Kang Min-jae had just realized something extraordinary. The woman whose life he had just turned upside down was the same woman who once protected the life of the person he loved most. There are moments when a single realization forces a powerful person to confront a truth they never expected. Not in a courtroom, not during a negotiation, but in a place where their authority suddenly feels complicated. On that rain-soaked night inside the damaged animal shelter, Kang Min-jae stood motionless while the pieces of the past finally aligned. The woman in front of him had just confirmed it. The voice he had heard months earlier. The stranger who refused to leave his mother's side on the pavement. The woman who stayed calm while others hesitated. The person who called for help when time mattered most. That stranger had a name. Zenith James. And at this very moment, she was standing inside a shelter his men had already begun tearing apart. A shelter she had fought to protect with everything she had. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Zenith looked at him with confusion, trying to understand why the destruction had suddenly stopped. Behind her, the animals were still restless. Dogs barked from their cages. A metal gate creaked as one of them pushed against it. Rain continued dripping through the broken roof, forming small puddles across the floor. Yet none of Min-jae's men moved. They were waiting, watching their leader, because they had all seen something unusual. Kang Min-jae was thinking, and when he paused like that, it usually meant something important was about to happen. His mind replayed the memory again. The hospital hallway. Doctors explaining how critical the first few minutes had been. The unknown woman who stayed beside his mother until the ambulance arrived. A stranger who had nothing to gain. No recognition. No reward. Just a simple decision to help. For months, Min-jae had searched for that person. He instructed his people to review footage from nearby cameras. Witnesses were questioned. Security teams spent hours analyzing recordings. But the trail had always ended the same way. A blurred image. A partial description. A voice without a face. And now, that mystery stood directly in front of him. The same woman whose shelter had just been damaged because of a decision he made. For the first time in years, Kang Min-jae felt the weight of something unfamiliar. Regret. He looked around the room. Broken boards. Spilled food. Animals pressed anxiously against the bars of their cages. And at the center of it all stood Zenith. Her jacket soaked. Her hands shaking slightly from exhaustion. But her eyes still steady. Still determined. She didn't know who he truly was. She didn't know about the months he spent trying to find the person who helped his mother. All she knew was that this man had arrived with a group of strangers and begun tearing apart the one place that protected the animals she cared about. From her perspective, there was nothing admirable about him. Nothing compassionate. Just power. And destruction. Min-jae slowly exhaled. The rain outside intensified, tapping harder against the broken boards of the shelter. Then he turned toward his men. The room immediately grew tense. Because every one of them knew the next words would determine what happened next. His voice, when it came, was calm. Firm. 3 simple words. Stop everything. Now. The effect was immediate. Tools lowered. Movement halted. A wooden beam that had been halfway removed was carefully set back against the wall. Even the men standing near the entrance stepped away from the cages. Within seconds, the chaos that had filled the shelter faded into an uneasy silence. Zenith stared at him. She hadn't expected that. Not after everything that had already happened. Why? She asked quietly. Min-jae didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked slowly toward the center of the room. His shoes stepped carefully over broken boards and scattered dog food. When he stopped, he looked directly at Zenith. You helped my mother, he said. The sentence sounded almost strange in the quiet room. Zenith blinked in surprise. The woman on the street, he continued. She's my mother. Understanding slowly crossed her face. For a moment she seemed unsure how to respond. I didn't know who she was, Zenith said softly. I just helped. Min-jae nodded once. That's exactly why it matters. Behind him, several of his men exchanged confused glances. They had never heard their boss speak this way before. The conversation felt personal. Human. Very different from the usual instructions he gave during business operations. Min-jae looked around the shelter again. Then he spoke to the group behind him. This building will not be removed. Another moment of silence followed. One of his senior advisors, who had arrived shortly after the demolition began, stepped forward cautiously. Sir, the development schedule. Min-jae raised his hand. The advisor stopped immediately. The schedule can change. The man hesitated. But the investors? They will adapt. Min-jae's tone left no room for argument. Then he said something that surprised everyone in the room. Rebuild it. The advisor blinked. Sir. Min-jae continued speaking, his voice steady. Repair the structure. He gestured toward the broken roof. Replace the damaged sections. Then he looked toward the outdoor yard beyond the doorway. And expand the property. Several of the men stared at him in disbelief. Zenith herself looked stunned. Min-jae began outlining the plan as if the decision had already been finalized. A proper veterinary wing will be added. He pointed toward the empty space beside the shelter. Medical equipment. Surgical capability. He turned toward another member of his team. Establish a permanent supply contract for food and medicine. The man nodded automatically, still trying to process what was happening. Min-jae continued. A larger outdoor area for the animals. Secure fencing. Climate control inside the building. Every instruction came quickly. Clearly. Like a project he had been planning for months. But this time, the objective was not profit. It was protection. Zenith finally found her voice. You're serious? Min-jae looked at her. Yes. The rain outside softened slightly. The sound of it filled the pause between them. Then Min-jae said something that none of the men standing around him had ever heard him say before. A person who saves life deserves protection. No dramatic speech followed. No attempt to justify the earlier destruction. Just a simple statement that carried its own meaning. Zenith stood quietly for a moment, absorbing everything that had just happened. Minutes earlier, her shelter had been on the verge of disappearing. Now the man responsible for that destruction was promising to rebuild it into something stronger. Something capable of helping far more animals than before. It felt almost impossible to believe. Yet every man in that room knew something important about Kang Min-jae. When he made a decision, he followed through. And on that night, in the middle of a damaged shelter filled with frightened animals, he had just made one of the most unexpected decisions of his life. Months passed after that rain-soaked night. The broken boards were cleared away. The damaged roof removed. The scattered cages replaced. At first, people in the neighborhood assumed the shelter would simply disappear like so many other small buildings in the city. Construction trucks arrived. Workers moved through the property. Blueprints were reviewed. Concrete was poured. But the changes that followed did not resemble a luxury development. They looked like something else entirely. A rebuilding. Stronger. Wider. Purposeful. Where the old wooden structure once stood, a new facility slowly began to take shape. Solid walls. Reinforced roofing. Wide windows that allowed sunlight to fill the interior during the day. The outdoor yard expanded beyond the original fence line. Fresh grass replaced the muddy patches where animals once struggled to run. New enclosures were built, larger, cleaner, safer. Inside the building, an entire wing was dedicated to medical care. Examination tables. Surgical equipment. Shelves stocked with supplies. Veterinary staff moved through the halls, preparing spaces that had never existed in the old shelter. For the first time, animals rescued from dangerous conditions could receive treatment immediately, without being transported across the city. Food storage rooms were filled. Water systems installed. Climate control units mounted along the walls to keep the animals comfortable during both summer heat and winter cold. To the outside world, the transformation seemed sudden. But behind the scenes, it followed the same disciplined structure that Kang Min-jae applied to every project under his authority. Detailed planning. Clear instructions. Immediate execution. Except this time, the purpose was different. Months after the construction began, the doors finally opened. The sign above the entrance had changed. No longer faded or crooked. Large letters now stretched across the front of the building. Second Chance Animal Rescue Center. On the morning of the opening, the yard filled with movement. Dogs ran across the grass. Some chasing balls tossed by volunteers. Others simply exploring the space, as if they could hardly believe the room they suddenly had to run. Cats rested along wide windowsills inside the building, soaking in warm sunlight. The air felt lighter, cleaner, and for the first time since the shelter began years earlier, Zenith James stood inside a place that no longer felt like it might collapse during the next storm. She walked slowly through the main corridor that morning, listening to the sounds around her. Animals playing, volunteers laughing, veterinarians discussing treatment plans for newly rescued dogs and cats. For years, Zenith had carried the weight of the shelter almost entirely on her own. Now there were people everywhere. Volunteers arriving from across the city. Donations arriving regularly. Medical staff ready to care for injured animals at a level the old shelter could never provide. What once felt like an impossible dream had become a functioning rescue center capable of helping hundreds of animals every year. Yet despite the dramatic changes, Zenith remained exactly where she had always been. At the center of it, greeting volunteers, checking cages, making sure every animal received the care it needed. The building was new, the resources were greater, but the mission remained exactly the same. Protect the abandoned, give them another chance. Occasionally, a quiet visitor arrived at the center. An elderly woman, small in stature, gray hair tied neatly behind her head. She walked slowly through the entrance, sometimes carrying a small bag of treats for the dogs. The staff always greeted her warmly. Some volunteers knew who she was. Others only recognized her as a regular guest who enjoyed sitting near the outdoor yard and watching the animals run. Zenith always made time to sit beside her. Their conversations were simple. Stories about the animals, memories of the day they first met. The elderly woman never forgot the moment when a stranger knelt beside her on a crowded sidewalk and refused to leave while she struggled to breathe. And Zenith never treated that moment as anything extraordinary. To her, it had simply been the right thing to do. Occasionally, another visitor appeared as well. He never stayed long, never arrived with an announcement. A black car would stop briefly outside the building. Kong Minjae would step out, walk through the entrance quietly. Sometimes he spoke with Zenith for a few minutes. Sometimes he simply stood near the yard, watching the animals play. The men who worked for him remained outside. Inside the rescue center, he was just another observer. A man whose life had once taken a very different path, now witnessing the results of a decision he never expected to make. The staff rarely approached him. Most understood that he preferred to remain unnoticed. But they also understood something else. Without his intervention, this place would never have existed. As the months passed, the rescue center became known throughout the city. More animals found shelter there. More volunteers arrived each week. Stories spread about the facility built on the edge of the district, the one that had grown from a nearly abandoned wooden structure into a fully equipped sanctuary. And while many people heard rumors about the powerful man who funded the transformation, very few knew the true reason behind it. Because the Real story was much simpler than anyone imagined. It began with a woman who stopped her car when she saw someone collapse on the sidewalk. A stranger who stayed. A voice offering calm words when fear filled the air. And months later, that same voice echoed through a broken animal shelter at exactly the moment it needed to be heard again. The world can often feel harsh. Decisions driven by power and profit shape the cities we live in. Buildings rise. Neighborhoods change. And small places, like a shelter for abandoned animals, can disappear almost overnight. But sometimes, one act of compassion travels farther than anyone expects. Sometimes the kindness offered in a quiet moment returns in ways no one could plan. Not through coincidence, not through chance, but through the simple truth that people remember those who stand beside them when it matters most. And on one rainy night, in a damaged shelter filled with frightened animals, that truth changed the direction of two lives. One decision saved a building, protected hundreds of animals, and created something stronger than either of them had imagined. Now there is only one question left. If you were Zenith, would you have forgiven him? Or would the damage have been too much? Tell me what you think in the comments. And before you go, I'd love to know something else. What country are you listening from today? If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video, share it with someone who believes in second chances, and subscribe for more inspiring and heartwarming stories like this. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.